March 10th, 1942. Indian Ocean, 200 miles south of Java. The water burned. Lieutenant Commander Donald McCarthy clung to a piece of shattered deck plating, watching black smoke coil into the tropical sky where HMS Ascot had been just minutes before. Around him, the sea churned with debris and drowning men. Oil spread across the surface like a wound, coating everything it touched, filling mouths and lungs with poison. The temperature read 92 degrees Fahrenheit, but McCarthy's hands trembled uncontrollably. What the 34-year-old British naval officer didn't know was that in the next 6 hours, his rescue would come not from Allied ships racing to save them, but from the very submarine that had just destroyed his vessel. That a Japanese commander, trained in the bushido code that demanded total victory and showed no mercy to enemies, would make a decision that defied every order he had received. That honor could exist even in the most brutal theater of the Pacific War, where savagery had become routine and compassion was considered weakness. The story that would unfold over the next day would remain buried in classified files for decades, suppressed by authorities on both sides who understood that such an incident complicated the simple narrative of racial hatred and total war that the Pacific conflict required. But the truth, when it finally emerged 50 years later, would reveal one of the most extraordinary acts of humanity in naval history. McCarthy had woken that morning aboard HMS Ascot, a converted merchant vessel pressed into service as an armed merchantman. At 2,800 tons, she was hardly a warship, just a cargo ship fitted with a few deck guns and pressed into convoy duty. Most of her crew were merchant seamen, not trained naval personnel. Yet each man was essential to the desperate effort to evacuate civilians and military personnel from the collapsing Dutch East Indies. The mission briefing had been clear and terrifying. Singapore had fallen 3 weeks earlier on February 15th. The Dutch East Indies were collapsing under relentless Japanese assault. Allied forces were in full retreat across Southeast Asia. Thousands of civilians, soldiers, and sailors needed evacuation before the Japanese net closed completely. Every available vessel was pressed into service, regardless of condition or armament. HMS Ascot had been assigned to evacuate refugees from Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. Intelligence reported that Japanese submarines were prowling the evacuation routes. Japanese surface ships were sweeping through the Java Sea. Japanese aircraft dominated the skies. The briefing officer had been blunt. Expect contact with enemy forces. Expect casualties. Some of you won't be coming back. McCarthy's vessel had been loaded far beyond safe capacity. 523 souls aboard a ship designed for perhaps 150. Women and children fleeing the Japanese advance crowded the holds. Wounded soldiers lay on makeshift stretchers. Dutch colonial officials who had ruled the islands for centuries now fled in panic. British military personnel retreated toward India. Everyone desperate, everyone terrified, everyone hoping to survive long enough to reach safety. The weather over the Indian Ocean had been deceptively peaceful. Clear skies, calm seas, gentle winds, the kind of weather that made sailors forget about war. But beneath that tranquil surface, death prowled in the form of Japanese submarine I-8, commanded by Captain Ariizumi Tatsunosuke. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Ariizumi had been born December 7th, 1899, in Fukuoka Prefecture, into a Japan that was transforming itself from feudal isolation into industrial power. His father had been a minor samurai, and Ariizumi had absorbed the bushido code from childhood. Loyalty to emperor, courage in battle, honor above life itself. These were not abstractions, but the foundation of his identity. By 1917, when he was just 18 years old, he had entered the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima. This was Japan's equivalent to Annapolis, an institution that produced the finest naval officers in Asia. The training was brutal, designed to break weak spirits and forge warriors who would never surrender. Ariizumi excelled. He graduated in 1921, ranking high in his class, already marked for command. Before the war, Ariizumi had served on destroyers and cruisers, learning navigation, tactics, and the art of naval warfare. But his true calling came with submarines. By the late 1930s, as war with the United States and Britain became increasingly likely, Japan invested heavily in submarine development. The Type B submarines, of which I-8 was one, were among the most advanced in the world. I-8 was a massive vessel by submarine standards, 356 feet long, displacing 2,600 tons when surfaced. She carried a crew of 101 men, cramped into spaces barely large enough to breathe. Her armament included 6 torpedo tubes, 17 torpedoes, and a deck gun capable of surface engagements. Her range exceeded 21,000 nautical miles, allowing her to operate deep in enemy waters for months without refueling. When war came on December 7, 1941, with the attack on Pearl Harbor, Ariizumi and I-8 were already at sea. Their mission was clear: disrupt Allied shipping, sink enemy vessels, terrorize the sea lanes that connected British India to the Dutch East Indies, support the rapid Japanese advance that was sweeping across Southeast Asia with stunning speed. By March 1942, the Japanese conquest was nearly complete. Malaya had fallen. Singapore had surrendered. The Philippines were collapsing. The Dutch East Indies were being overrun. Japanese forces had achieved in 3 months what military planners had expected to take years. The speed of victory was intoxicating, creating an atmosphere of invincibility. But this rapid success also created a darkness. As Japanese forces advanced, incidents of brutality multiplied. The rape of Nanking in 1937 had already demonstrated the capacity for atrocity. The treatment of Allied prisoners of war was becoming increasingly savage. The idea of showing mercy to enemies, particularly Western enemies who were considered racially inferior, was being systematically discouraged. Ariizumi himself had received clear orders. Enemy vessels were to be destroyed without warning. Survivors were not to be rescued unless they possessed valuable intelligence. The war in the Pacific was to be total, uncompromising, without sentiment. These orders came directly from Naval Command, reflecting the increasingly fanatical direction of Japanese military policy. On the morning of March 10th, I-8 had been patrolling submerged, periscope depth, searching for targets. The waters south of Java were rich with fleeing Allied shipping, merchant vessels, military transports. Anything that could float was being pressed into service for the desperate evacuation. For a submarine commander, it was a target-rich environment. At 1100 hours local time, the sonar operator detected propeller sounds. Ariizumi moved to the periscope, scanning the horizon. Through the magnified lens, he saw HMS Ascot silhouetted against the bright tropical sky. A single merchant vessel, no escorts, moving at perhaps 12 knots, an easy target. Ariizumi made his calculations with practiced precision: range, speed, intercept angle. He ordered the torpedo room to prepare tubes 1 and 2. The crew moved with quiet efficiency, men who had trained together for years, who knew their roles instinctively. The torpedoes were loaded, armed, ready to fire. The submarine moved into attack position. Ariizumi watched through the periscope as HMS Ascot continued on her course, oblivious to the danger beneath the waves. He could see people on deck, civilians enjoying the sunshine, unaware that death was seconds away. For a moment, something flickered in his mind. A question. A doubt. Then training and duty took over. He gave the order. Fire 1. Fire 2. The torpedoes leaped from their tubes with compressed air, their electric motors driving them through the water at 46 knots. They left barely a trace, just a faint wake that disappeared almost immediately. The crew waited in tense silence, counting seconds, calculating distance. 73 seconds after launch, the first torpedo struck HMS Ascot amidships, just below the waterline. The explosion was massive, tearing a hole 15 feet wide in the hull. The ship shuddered, heeling violently to starboard. Before the crew could even react, the second torpedo struck near the engine room, and this explosion was catastrophic. The boilers exploded, sending superheated steam through the engineering spaces, killing everyone there instantly. The fuel tanks ruptured, spilling oil that ignited immediately, turning the water around the ship into a lake of fire. The structural integrity failed within seconds. The ship began to break apart, her back literally snapped by the force of the explosions. McCarthy had been on the bridge when the torpedoes struck. The first explosion threw him against the bulkhead, stunning him. The second explosion knocked him unconscious. He came to, perhaps 30 seconds later, to find the ship listing so severely that walking was impossible. Smoke and flame erupted from below decks. Screams filled the air, the sound of people trapped in flooding compartments, people burning, people dying. The order to abandon ship came within minutes, but it was chaos. The lifeboats on the starboard side couldn't be launched because of the severe list. The port side boats were smashed by the explosions or burned by the spreading fire. Life rafts were thrown into the water, but many sank immediately, damaged or poorly maintained. 523 people fought for their lives, and there was almost nothing to save them. McCarthy made it into the water. He didn't remember how. One moment he was on the tilting deck, the next he was swimming through oil-covered water, gasping, choking, his lungs burning from inhaled fuel. Around him, people thrashed and screamed. Some clung to debris. Others simply floated, already dead from the explosions or drowned in the first moments of panic. The ship took 12 minutes to sink. McCarthy watched it go down, the bow lifting high into the air, propellers exposed, water pouring from her decks. Then she slid beneath the surface with a roar of escaping air and collapsing bulkheads, leaving behind only smoke, oil, and the cries of the dying. The immediate aftermath was hell realized. The oil made breathing nearly impossible. It coated faces, blinded eyes, choked throats. The tropical sun beat down mercilessly, reflecting off the water with blinding intensity. Within minutes, dehydration became critical. The salt water burned exposed skin. Sharks appeared, drawn by blood and the vibrations of struggling bodies. McCarthy tried to count survivors, but it was impossible. People were scattered across perhaps 2 square miles of ocean. Some clung to wreckage, others had found life rafts or floating debris, but many were simply in the water with nothing, their strength failing minute by minute, drowning in slow motion. The realization settled over everyone who remained conscious. They were 200 miles from the nearest land. No distress signal had been sent because the radio room was destroyed in the first explosion. No Allied ships knew their position. The Japanese controlled these waters. Even if they survived the immediate drowning, the sun exposure, the oil poisoning, and the sharks. What then? Capture? Execution? Death by exposure over days instead of hours? McCarthy floated, conserving his strength, watching people around him give up and slip beneath the surface. He thought of his wife in England, his 2 daughters he hadn't seen in 3 years. He thought about the absurdity of surviving the evacuations from France in 1940, surviving the Blitz, surviving 3 years of war, only to drown in the Indian Ocean, unknown and unmourned. Then something impossible appeared on the horizon, a submarine surfacing, water cascading off its conning tower. McCarthy's first thought was terror. The Japanese submarine that had sunk them was returning, perhaps to machine gun survivors, a war crime that had become increasingly common in the Pacific. He had heard the stories, whispered in officers' messes, about Japanese submarines surfacing to murder survivors with deck guns and machine guns, ensuring no witnesses remained. But as I-8 completed her surface, something unexpected happened. Instead of training guns on the survivors, crewmen appeared on deck with ropes and life rings. Instead of the bark of gunfire, voices called out in heavily accented English, "Help coming! Swim to boat! We rescue!" McCarthy couldn't process what he was seeing. The enemy was offering rescue? It made no sense. It violated everything he knew about Japanese naval doctrine, about the savagery that characterized the Pacific War. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Japanese sailors were throwing lines into the water, pulling survivors aboard, working with urgent efficiency to save the very people they had just tried to kill. Later, McCarthy would learn what had happened aboard E8 Inches the minutes after the attack. Arizumi had remained at periscope depth, observing the results of his torpedo attack. Standard procedure was to verify the kill, photograph if possible, then dive and depart the area before Allied aircraft or warships arrived. But as Arizumi watched through his periscope, he saw something that changed everything. He saw women and children in the water, not just military personnel, but families. Mothers holding babies above the oil-covered surface, children clinging to debris, their faces masks of terror, old men too weak to swim, wounded soldiers unable to help themselves, hundreds of helpless people drowning slowly while he watched. Arizumi was a professional naval officer, trained to follow orders, conditioned to show no mercy to enemies. The orders from command were clear. Leave no survivors. The prevailing attitude in the Imperial Japanese Navy by March 1942 was that mercy was weakness, that Western prisoners were beneath contempt, that total war required total ruthlessness. But Arizumi was also a man raised in the older samurai tradition, a code that valued honor above victory, that recognized obligations even to defeated enemies. He remembered his father's teachings about bushido, the true warrior's way that predated the twisted militarism of the 1930s. A true samurai did not make war on women and children. A true warrior showed strength through mercy, not through cruelty. For several minutes, Arizumi stood at the periscope, silent, unmoving. His executive officer waited for orders. The crew sensed something unusual was happening, but discipline held them silent. Finally, Arizumi made his decision. He turned to his executive officer and spoke quietly. "We surface. We rescue them." The executive officer's face showed shock, then concern, then something like relief. He understood immediately the enormity of what Arizumi was ordering. They would be violating direct commands from naval headquarters. They would be exposing their submarine to potential air attack while rescuing enemy personnel. They would be risking court-martial or worse if word of this reached the wrong people in Tokyo. But the executive officer also understood that some orders were more important than others. Some decisions defined who you were as a human being, regardless of uniform or nationality. I-8 surfaced 200 yards from the main group of survivors. The conning tower broke through the oil-slicked water, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then Arizumi appeared on the bridge, followed by crew members carrying ropes and life rings. In his limited English, learned from years of naval training that had included foreign language instruction, he called out to the survivors, "Japan submarine, we help. Come, no fear." The response was mixed. Some survivors, too exhausted to care, simply swam toward the submarine, desperate for any chance at survival. Others hesitated, wondering if this was a trap, if they would be machine-gunned the moment they got close. A few refused entirely, preferring to take their chances in the water rather than surrender to the enemy. McCarthy made his decision quickly. Death was certain in the water. Rescue, even from the enemy, offered a chance. He swam toward I-8, his strength nearly gone, his vision blurring from oil and exhaustion. Japanese sailors reached down, grabbed his arms, and hauled him onto the deck with surprising gentleness. He collapsed on the steel plating, gasping, coughing up oil and seawater. Around him, the rescue operation unfolded with impressive efficiency. Ariazumi had organized his crew into teams. Some pulled survivors from the water, others provided first aid on deck. Still others carried the rescued below, clearing space in every available compartment. The submarine was not designed to carry passengers. Every inch of space was normally occupied by equipment, weapons, supplies, or crew. But the Japanese sailors improvised, clearing areas, making room, showing a compassion that seemed impossible given the circumstances. The rescue took 6 hours. 6 hours of exhausting labor under the tropical sun. 6 hours of constant vigilance. Watching the skies for Allied aircraft that would attack without warning if they spotted a surfaced submarine. 6 hours of pulling oil-covered, half-drowned people from the water, one by one, until arms ached and backs screamed with fatigue. Not everyone could be saved. Some had already drowned before the rescue began. Others were too far away, scattered beyond reach. A few refused rescue, either from fear or from a sense that accepting help from the enemy was somehow dishonorable. By the time darkness fell, I-8 had rescued 137 survivors from HMS Ascot. 137 people who should have died, who had every reason to believe they would die, now found themselves crammed into a Japanese submarine, uncertain whether they had been rescued or captured, whether they would see their homes again or spend the rest of the war in prison camps, whether this act of mercy would continue, or whether it was simply a prelude to interrogation and execution. McCarthy found himself in the forward torpedo room, lying on the deck between the massive tubes, surrounded by dozens of other survivors and Japanese sailors who stepped carefully around them. The air was hot, humid, thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and fear. But he was alive. Against all probability, against all logic, he was alive. An older Japanese sailor, perhaps 50 years old, with grey streaking his hair, approached with a canteen of water. He knelt beside McCarthy, helped him sit up, and held the canteen to his lips. The water was warm, metallic tasting, but it was the most precious thing McCarthy had ever experienced. He drank carefully, fighting the urge to gulp it down, knowing that too much too fast would make him sick. The sailor nodded approvingly, then offered a piece of ship's biscuit. McCarthy took it with trembling hands, noticing for the first time the calluses on the Japanese sailor's palms, the way his uniform was worn thin at the elbows, the exhaustion in his eyes. This man was not a monster. He was just a sailor, doing his duty. Now extending kindness to an enemy who moments before he might have killed without hesitation. Around the torpedo room, similar scenes played out. Japanese sailors shared their meagre rations with British survivors. They offered blankets, despite the tropical heat, to those shivering from shock. They tended wounds with medical supplies that were already scarce aboard the submarine. They spoke in broken English, gesturing, trying to communicate reassurance. No harm. You safe now. We go port soon. But the situation aboard I-8 was far from comfortable. The submarine was designed for 101 crew members, and conditions were already cramped under normal circumstances. Now, with an additional 137 survivors packed into every available space, the submarine became almost unbearable. The air grew thick and stale within hours. The heat was oppressive, regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the lower compartments. The humidity made breathing difficult. Every movement required careful negotiation around bodies pressed together like cargo. The toilet facilities, designed for a crew of 100, could not possibly accommodate 238 people. Lines formed, and the wait could be hours. Many survivors, weakened by their ordeal, suffered from seasickness in the confined, swaying spaces below the waterline. The smell became overwhelming within the first day, a mixture of unwashed bodies, oil that still coated everyone's skin, vomit, and human waste. Food was another critical problem. Submarine rations were calculated precisely for the crew's needs during extended patrols. There was no surplus, no emergency reserve sufficient for this many additional mouths. Ariazumi ordered rations cut by more than half. Both his crew and the survivors would receive minimal food, just enough to sustain life, until they reached port. The Japanese sailors accepted this without complaint, understanding the necessity. The survivors, already weakened, found the hunger almost unbearable. Water was even more precious than food. Fresh water aboard a submarine was severely limited, used primarily for drinking and cooking. Bathing was impossible. Washing was a luxury unavailable to anyone. The oil that coated the survivors remained on their skin, in their hair, clogging pores, causing rashes and infections. Some developed severe skin conditions within days. Others suffered from salt water sores that refused to heal in the humid, unsanitary conditions. Medical supplies were exhausted within the first 48 hours. I-8 carried a basic medical kit designed for treating the crew's minor injuries and illnesses. It was completely inadequate for treating the injuries sustained by survivors of a torpedo attack. Burns from the fires that had swept HMS Ascot's decks, broken bones from the explosions, lacerations from debris, oil poisoning from swallowing contaminated seawater, infections that set in rapidly in the tropical heat. The submarine's medical officer, a young lieutenant named Yamamoto, who had minimal training in emergency medicine, worked around the clock. He had no anesthesia for setting broken bones, no antibiotics for fighting infections, no burn ointments for treating severe injuries. He did what he could with bandages, aspirin, and improvisation. Some patients improved, others deteriorated. 3 survivors died in the first week aboard I-8, their bodies committed to the sea with brief ceremonies that acknowledged both their suffering and the crew's inability to save them. Despite the hardships, something remarkable emerged in the claustrophobic confines of I-8. A strange bond formed between captors and captives, between enemies who found themselves sharing the same unbearable conditions. The Japanese crew saw the suffering of the survivors and felt compassion, even though these were the people their nation was at war with. The survivors saw the sacrifices the Japanese sailors made, sharing their own inadequate rations, giving up their sleeping spaces, working exhausted to keep everyone alive. Language barriers slowly broke down. The survivors learned basic Japanese phrases. Thank you. Water. Please. I am sick. The Japanese sailors practiced their limited English, often with comic results that brought unexpected laughter to the grim situation. Small exchanges became meaningful. A Japanese sailor showing a British survivor a photograph of his family in Tokyo. A British survivor teaching a Japanese sailor an English song. These moments of connection transcended the propaganda both sides had been fed. McCarthy found himself in conversation with Ariazumi on the 3rd day. The captain had summoned him to the cramped wardroom, a small space where officers normally ate their meals. Through an interpreter, a Japanese officer who had studied at university in California before the war, Ari Izumi explained his decision. "I saw women and children in water," the interpreter translated. "Bushido code, say warrior, does not make war on helpless. I could not leave them to die. It would shame me, shame my ancestors, shame Japan." McCarthy listened, trying to reconcile this man's words with everything he had been told about Japanese brutality. The stories of atrocities in China, the reports of prisoners tortured and murdered, the accounts of wounded soldiers bayoneted where they lay. Yet here was a Japanese officer speaking of honor and mercy, who had risked his career and possibly his life to save enemies. Which version was true? Perhaps both were, McCarthy realized. Perhaps war created both monsters and saints, sometimes in the same person. Ari Izumi asked about McCarthy's family, about his life before the war, about what he would do after, if he survived. The conversation was halting, awkward, conducted through the interpreter with long pauses. But it was genuine. Two professional naval officers, both far from home, both caught in a war neither had chosen, finding common ground in the simple fact of their shared humanity. As the days passed, the submarine made slow progress toward port. Ari Izumi had decided to head for Penang, a port in Malaya that had recently fallen to Japanese forces. The journey would take nearly 2 weeks at the submarine's economical cruising speed. Every day was a gamble. Allied aircraft patrolled these waters. Allied submarines hunted Japanese vessels. The longer I-8 remained at sea, burdened with survivors who could not fight and could barely move, the greater the risk. The crew maintained constant vigilance. Sonar operators listened for approaching ships. Periscope watches scanned the horizon for aircraft. The submarine dove repeatedly when threats appeared, forcing everyone into terrifying silence as depth charges exploded in the distance. During these dives, with the ventilation shut down and the air growing stale, the suffering intensified. People gasped for breath. Some panicked, had to be restrained. The heat became suffocating. But everyone survived, held together by the shared understanding that they depended utterly on each other. The survivors learned the rhythms of submarine life, the watch changes every 4 hours, the quiet that descended when the submarine dove, with engines shut down, and everyone moving in whispered silence, the relief when surfacing at night, when the hatches opened and fresh air rushed in like a blessing, the constant background hum of machinery, the smell of diesel fuel, the way the submarine rolled in even moderate seas. Some survivors, those with naval experience, offered to help with basic tasks. The Japanese crew accepted cautiously at first, then more readily. British sailors helped in the galley, preparing the meagre meals. They assisted with cleaning, an endless task in the crowded conditions. They learned to move through the submarine without disrupting the crew's work. A strange cooperation emerged, enemies working side by side to keep everyone alive. Children were aboard, though only 7 had survived the sinking. The youngest was 3 years old, a Dutch girl whose parents had both died when HMS Ascot went down. She was adopted by the entire submarine crew, Japanese and British alike. Sailors who had children of their own back home doted on her, sharing extra morsels of food, fashioning toys from scraps of paper and string. She learned to laugh again, her voice echoing through the metal corridors, a sound so out of place in that environment that it seemed miraculous. The women survivors faced particular challenges. Aboard a vessel designed for men only, privacy was impossible. Bathing, changing clothes, dealing with basic biological needs, all became exercises in humiliation and improvisation. Yet the Japanese crew showed remarkable discretion and respect. Spaces were curtained off as best as possible. Male crew members looked away, gave privacy where they could. No incidents of harassment occurred. a testament to the discipline Ariizumi maintained and the code of honor his crew followed. As the second week began, food became critical. Rations were reduced again. Everyone aboard received 1 meal per day, barely enough to sustain body weight. Hunger became constant, gnawing, consuming every thought. People grew weak. Movement became difficult. Yet still the submarine pushed on toward Penang, day after day, mile after mile. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. On March 22nd, 12 days after rescuing the survivors, I-8 finally reached Penang. The submarine surfaced in the harbour, flying the Japanese naval ensign. Word had been radioed ahead, and the response from shore had been decidedly mixed. Some officers praised Ariizumi's humanitarian action. Others questioned whether rescuing enemy personnel had been appropriate. A few openly criticized the decision as weakness, suggesting that the survivors should have been left to die or, worse, should have been interrogated and then executed. When the survivors were finally brought ashore, they could barely walk. Nearly 2 weeks in the submarine's cramped conditions, combined with minimal food and water, had left them skeletal and weak. Many had lost 20 pounds or more. Their skin was covered in sores and rashes. Their hair was matted with oil that still hadn't been completely washed out. They looked like concentration camp survivors, and in a sense, they were. The Japanese authorities in Penang were unprepared for the arrival of 137 British and Dutch civilians and military personnel. There were no proper POW facilities ready, no medical staff prepared to treat them, no supplies allocated for their care. For several days, the survivors were held in a warehouse near the docks, sleeping on the concrete floor, receiving minimal food and water, their status uncertain. McCarthy and the other military personnel expected to be sent to prisoner of war camps. The civilians, including the women and children, hoped they might be repatriated through neutral countries, though this seemed increasingly unlikely as the war intensified. The reality was that no one knew quite what to do with them. They were an anomaly, rescued enemies who owed their lives to Japanese mercy, now caught in a system that had no category for such people. Eventually, most of the military survivors were transferred to POW camps in various locations across Southeast Asia. The conditions in these camps were harsh, and many would not survive the war. Malnutrition, disease, forced labor, and occasional brutality took a terrible toll. Of the 137 people Ariizumi saved from drowning, approximately 90 survived to see the end of the war in August 1945. The others died in captivity, their rescue ultimately only delaying their deaths. The women and children were treated somewhat better, eventually being moved to civilian internment camps where conditions, while difficult, were less brutal than the military POW camps. Most of these survived the war and were repatriated. The young Dutch girl who had been adopted by the submarine crew was eventually reunited with distant relatives in Australia after the war. For Ariizumi, the aftermath of his decision was complex. When he returned to his base and filed his patrol report, the rescue of the HMS Ascot survivors was noted but not emphasized. His superiors chose not to make an issue of it, neither praising nor condemning his actions. In the Japanese military culture of 1942, showing mercy to enemies was becoming increasingly discouraged, seen as weakness in the total war mentality that dominated Japanese strategic thinking. But Ariizumi was too senior, too respected, and too successful as a submarine commander to be seriously disciplined. He continued to serve throughout the war, conducting numerous patrols, sinking Allied shipping, and becoming one of Japan's most effective submarine commanders. Yet something had changed in him after that March day. He continued to follow orders, continued to attack enemy vessels, but he never again left survivors to die when rescue was possible. In September 1944, Ariazumi was given command of a submarine group conducting operations in the Indian Ocean. By this time, the war had turned decisively against Japan. American forces were advancing across the Pacific. Japanese shipping was being decimated by Allied submarines. The Imperial Navy was losing the war at sea, and everyone knew it, though few dared speak this truth aloud. During this period, Ariazumi's submarines sank several Allied merchant vessels. In at least one documented case, after sinking a British freighter, Ariazumi ordered his submarine to surface and rescue survivors, providing them with food, water, and medical treatment before transferring them to a neutral vessel. This action was specifically noted in British naval records after the war, marking Ariazumi as unusual among Japanese submarine commanders. But the war was taking its toll on everyone. The increasingly desperate situation led to increasingly desperate measures. Orders came down for more aggressive action, less mercy, total commitment to destroying the enemy regardless of cost. The same military that had once valued bushido honor was now embracing a twisted version of that code that justified any action in service of the emperor. When the war ended on August 15, 1945, with Japan's surrender, Ariazumi faced a difficult decision. He knew that war crimes trials were coming, that many Japanese military officers would be prosecuted for atrocities. While his rescue of the HMS Ascot survivors was a mitigating factor, other actions during his naval service might be viewed differently by Allied prosecutors. The uncertainty was unbearable. On August 16, 1945, one day after Japan's surrender, Captain Ariazumi Tatsunosuke committed suicide. The exact circumstances remain unclear. Some records suggest he shot himself, others indicate he may have drowned himself. What is clear is that he chose death over surrender, following a tradition that many Japanese officers embraced in the war's final days. His death meant that the full story of the HMS Ascot rescue remained largely unknown for decades. The survivors who owed their lives to Ariazumi's decision scattered across the world after the war. Most returned to Britain or Australia. A few settled in other countries. They carried their memories in silence, uncertain how to explain to families and friends that a Japanese submarine commander had shown them mercy when mercy seemed impossible. McCarthy returned to England after his liberation in 1945. He had survived 3 years in Japanese POW camps, enduring malnutrition, disease, and forced labour. When he finally stepped off the ship at Southampton, his wife barely recognised him. He had lost 50 pounds and looked 20 years older. But he was alive, and he knew he owed that life to an enemy commander who had chosen honour over orders. For years after the war, McCarthy tried to find information about Ariazumi. He wrote letters to the British Admiralty, to Japanese naval authorities, to anyone who might have records. He wanted to thank the man who saved him, to acknowledge the debt he owed. When he finally learned in 1953 that Ariazumi had died by suicide in 1945, McCarthy was devastated. He would never be able to express his gratitude to the man who had given him 40 more years of life. In 1968, McCarthy travelled to Japan for the first time since the war. He visited Fukuoka Prefecture, where Ariazumi had been born. He met with Ariazumi's surviving family members, including a nephew who had become a Buddhist monk. Through translators, McCarthy told them the story of March 1942, of the rescue that had saved 137 lives, of the honour and mercy that Ariazumi had shown when showing mercy was considered weakness. Ariazumi's family wept. They had known their uncle had died at war's end, but they had not known the full story of his service. The rescue of enemy survivors had been buried in military records, never publicised, never acknowledged. Now, more than 2 decades later, a British naval officer was telling them that their uncle had been a hero, not just for Japan but for humanity. McCarthy worked with Japanese historians to document the incident. He provided testimony, written records, names of other survivors who could corroborate the story. Slowly, painstakingly, the truth emerged from the classified files and fading memories. By the 1970s, the rescue was becoming known in naval history circles, though it remained obscure to the general public. Other survivors began coming forward with their own accounts. A Dutch woman who had been a teenager when HMS Ascot sank wrote about the kindness of the Japanese sailors who shared their rations with starving civilians. A British merchant seaman described how a Japanese medic had worked through the night to treat his infected leg, probably saving him from amputation. A young girl, now elderly, remembered Japanese sailors fashioning a doll for her from scraps of cloth. These testimonies painted a picture that contradicted the simple narrative of Japanese brutality that had dominated post-war accounts. Yes, terrible atrocities had occurred. The Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, the mistreatment of POWs. These were undeniable realities. But so too was this story of rescue and mercy, of an enemy commander who chose to save rather than kill, who risked his career and his life to uphold a code of honor that transcended nationality. In 1992, 50 years after the rescue, a memorial ceremony was held in Penang. Surviving veterans from I-8's crew, now elderly men in their 70s and 80s, attended. So did several survivors from HMS Ascot, including McCarthy, now 74 years old. They met on the dock where the submarine had brought its rescued passengers ashore half a century earlier. The meeting was emotional. Men who had been enemies, who had lived through hell together, embraced as brothers. They shared memories, looked at old photographs, and marveled that they had all survived long enough to meet again. The Japanese veterans spoke of Arizumi with respect and sadness, remembering a commander who had been both strict and compassionate. The British survivors spoke of their gratitude, acknowledging that every day of their lives since March 1942 had been a gift from a man who had chosen mercy. A small monument was erected near Penang Harbour, bearing inscriptions in English, Japanese, and Malay. It commemorates the rescue and honours Captain Ariizumi Tatsunosuke, noting his decision to save enemy lives at great personal risk. The monument includes the names of all 137 survivors, and the names of the 101 crew members of I-8 who made the rescue possible. The story of I-8 and HMS Ascot has become a subject of historical analysis and moral reflection. Military ethicists study it as an example of the tensions between duty and conscience in warfare. Historians examine it as evidence that even in the Pacific War's brutal environment, individual choices could transcend the hatred and propaganda. Cultural scholars explore how the incident reflects the complex nature of bushido honor in modern Japanese military culture. For the families of both the rescuers and the rescued, the story has profound meaning. Ariizumi's descendants take pride in knowing that their ancestor upheld true honor when honor was being corrupted by militarism. The descendants of the HMS Ascot survivors, numbering in the hundreds now across several generations, understand that they owe their very existence to a Japanese submarine commander's decision on a March day in 1942. McCarthy lived until 1997, dying at age 79 in his home in England. In his final years, he gave numerous interviews about the rescue, always emphasizing that Ariizumi had been a man of honor who represented the best of the samurai tradition. He established a small scholarship fund for British students studying Japanese history and culture, hoping to promote understanding between the nations that had once been bitter enemies. The rescue of HMS Ascot survivors stands as one of the great acts of mercy in naval warfare. In a conflict characterized by atrocities and brutality, where racial hatred had been weaponized by both sides, where showing mercy to enemies was considered weakness or even treason, Captain Ariizumi Tatsunosuke made a choice that defined who he was. He saw helpless people drowning and could not leave them to die, regardless of uniform or nationality. That decision saved 137 lives directly. It saved hundreds more indirectly, as those survivors went on to have children and grandchildren. By conservative estimates, more than 500 people alive today owe their existence to a Japanese submarine commander who chose honor over orders, mercy over military expediency, and humanity over hatred. The story also demonstrates the complexity of war and the danger of simple narratives. The same Japanese military that committed unspeakable atrocities also produced men like Ariizumi, who upheld genuine honor. The same Bushido code that was twisted to justify brutality was also the code that motivated acts of extraordinary mercy. War brings out both the worst and the best in humanity, sometimes in the same people, sometimes in the same moment. For those who survived that day in March 1942, the memory never faded. They carried it with them through POW camps, through the difficult return to normal life, through decades of peace. Some struggled with guilt, wondering why they had survived when so many others had died. Others found meaning in their survival, dedicating themselves to promoting reconciliation and understanding between former enemies. The Japanese sailors who participated in the rescue also carried the memory. They had disobeyed the prevailing military culture to help enemies, risking punishment to do what they believed was right. After the war, some spoke openly about it. Others remained silent, uncertain whether their actions would be viewed as honorable or as a betrayal of their comrades who had fought with such ferocity. What is beyond dispute is that on March 10, 1942, in the Indian Ocean 200 miles south of Java, something remarkable occurred. An enemy became a rescuer. Warriors became saviors. And 137 people who should have died were given the gift of life by a man who understood that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to know when destruction is not required. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.